computer or phone. Type any questions that you may have into the chat box. Sandy is going to be monitoring that, and we will, as always, be recording the call, and we will post the recording and the slides on the website. It is Wednesday, April the 22nd, just in case anyone like me needed to kind of reorient to when we were. I appreciate everyone taking time this afternoon. We're going to jump right into things as soon as I can figure out how to make this move. Aha. So we're going to talk today about some updates, plans, and then a little bit of conversation about the differences between extended school year, compensatory, and school closure services. I want to take a minute. I'm assuming that most folks have heard one way or another that the announcement was made about 11:15 today to have schools remain closed for the rest of the year. That is something that we are now all facing. And again, if I could ask everybody to mute their phones or their computers, please. So this is something that we are now facing as reality, schools being closed through the rest of this year. We do not have information about what will happen after that. If it is safe, the last couple of weeks, Molly indicated that we would, schools and districts would be working with students and parents to try to return textbooks, instructional materials, those kinds of things, if that's what we need to do. We do not know at this point how this will affect summer school, summer services, summer reading camp, or any of those things. I would encourage everybody to take a moment and take a deep breath. Remember that this is impacting all students, and that the purpose of special education and related services is to provide services and supports that students with disabilities need in order to access and progress in the general curriculum. Special ed is not separate and apart. It is not different. The whole purpose, the sole reason for special education related services and IEPs are to provide access to the general curriculum and provide services that are designed to provide meaningful benefit to students so that they can access the general curriculum. As with everything else up to this point, there are lots of rumors circulating. There are sometimes things that are misspoken or misunderstood or misinterpreted. We will talk a little later in this call about some of the differences in the kinds of services that we're looking at: extended school year, school closure services, compensatory services. And I hope that as we get into the discussion and then ask for your feedback on these areas, that you'll feel a little more comfortable with where we're going and how we're trying to navigate in a world that we're not really sure what will be on the other side of the door when we finally get to open that door. But again, just a reminder, and I know that this is the group that probably least needs this kind of reminder, but until we know what gen ed instruction looks like, we as special educators don't know how we need to provide the support to access that gen ed instruction. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Peter to talk a little bit about planning. We kind of started this discussion last week, and I'm going to ask Peter if he'll kind of pick up and walk us through some of the considerations for planning.
Hello, good afternoon. So now that we know that the schools will be closed until the end of the school year, the question is, what to do next. And I think it is a good time to take stock of what your district is currently providing with respect to instruction and services for students with disabilities. So what does it look like right now? And it is one of those things, since it was one that wasn't anticipated, that the capacity to deliver instruction or deliver some type of learning opportunity remotely has increased over time. And some of the teachers have gotten better at it, have been able to access additional resources. There may be additional infrastructure that got put into place. I know some districts have, put Wi-Fi on buses so that more students are able to access the internet. All those things have occurred, so you kind of look at what you have now and say, okay, well, we're going to have to finish out the school year with this school closure and remotely providing learning opportunities for our students. So taking a look at that and saying, can we expand it in some way, or can we provide some additional services during the remainder of the school year now that we know that this is going to be the format that we're going to have to utilize. Some of the things might be limited by the infrastructure that's in place. And by doing that, you look first to the learning opportunities that are being provided to all students, and then think about how you can support that type of instruction, that type of learning opportunity. And then, you look to summer, and there'll be, discussion later about how to distinguish between ESY services and compensatory services, and then these supplemental COVID closure services. But you want to look at, from your district, what would you be able to provide in the summer? And we'll talk about that in a future slide, that there might be a few different models that you'd have to anticipate. And unlike prior years, I don't think you can just think about one way of accomplishing this. You're probably going to have to think of alternative ways. So you may have a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C, depending on what's possible at the time. So, our thought is, and we're hoping that there'll be able to be some kind of summer programming. We're calling it maybe an instructional jumpstart, whether that's towards the end of the summer to assist students coming back. Might be the best option, but right now we're not sure what it's going to look like. But you can start to anticipate some of these things. In other words, how can you assess the gaps that are going to naturally occur during this time period? So how do you assess them? What measures are you going to use? I mean, one way you could start, obviously, is assessing the goals and the goal progress. And this may be after what you would consider a kind of a gap in learning opportunities. And then how do you address this? What summer learning opportunities might be used to basically close the gap? Can we do some intensive instruction before the school year begins in order to close that gap or the regression that may have occurred due to the large closure period? And then when and how these should be delivered. And once again, I think on the next slide, we talked about a few different options that might be feasible. So, some districts have a lot of students with, our majority of their students with one-to-one devices, and they have the ability to do some virtual learning. They may have to have some plan for face-to-face, and we're talking about summer here again, some face-to-face with some virtual, a combination of two, or maybe some small group individual with some preventative measures put into place, so we ensure social distancing, but still providing small group. And then we may target, a district may choose to target a certain population of students that they feel that they could bring back for a small group or individual type instruction, even if it's for a few weeks or 2 to 4 weeks, target some students who really need to address what could be the possible regression. So in this situation, there's certainly no normal plan in place where these are all very unusual ways of doing it. But I think one thing to think about is to walk through some of the options and to determine how much they would cost possibly on a weekly basis. And then once we get more clarity with respect to funding, you could take a look at it and say, okay, well, this plan A, is going to take this amount of resources. We're going to need this number of staff, and we're going to need this amount of money to fund this program for this time period. But all of these things have a lot of factors. We know that, but it's good to start contemplating what it might look like, and to try to minimize some of the impact to the students with disabilities by some planning of some learning opportunities during the summer months. All right, next slide.
Yeah, and as Peter was saying, we really don't know what things are going to look like at this point. The summer reading camps that we've typically thought of for our third graders, the summer additional learning opportunities. I think you heard Molly talk about a group that's coming together to talk about what that might look like. Again, the first thing we've got to look at is what's going on in your district. What will happen in your district, and then we start asking the question of, well, how can our students with disabilities access that? One of the biggest challenges we're going to have for all students is figuring out what that gap is. I mean, what will happen as a result of this closure? I think you also heard Molly mention that there are about 19 districts that have been able to go pretty much totally virtual. Well, we've got 86, 87, 88 districts in the state. That's a tremendous amount of districts that haven't been able to do that. So how do we make this kind of we're used to individualizing things in special ed. I think we're going to have to get used to being more individual as districts as well, and even schools within districts, to figure out where kids in a particular area are, where they need to be, and how we can get them there. This is something that in special ed we've been used to doing. This is how we operate. Where should our kid be? Where is he now, and how are we going to get him there? So I think our skills, our experience, our knowledge will be crucial throughout this process. And I hope that you all already have a seat at the table as this planning is happening. If not, I would encourage you to try any way you can to insinuate yourselves into this type of planning. Because again, I think that we're the group that has the knowledge and skills to be able to do this. Peter, did you want to say anything else as far as the plans are concerned?
No, I think that was it. I mean, just like I said, I think it's important to have contingency plans, as we've kind of learned. I mean, some of the districts that had started doing some of those makeup days, the electronic makeup days, and had piloted some of that, had some infrastructure that was put in place and may have been slightly more prepared for a time period where we had to do learning opportunities during the school closures. But I think, at this point, when you make plans, just making sure that you do have contingencies for the various possibilities of how it would be delivered. We're just having to think about that now. You can't have a plan A and adjust. You have to have a plan A and a plan B And so I think that's the key, and it's hard when you're uncertain as to what resources you're going to need. But I think to start looking at that and to start making some estimates is the smartest thing to do at this time.
It also may be beneficial to think about this either in chunks of time or periods of time or conditions. So it may help to think of this as, what are our plans for from now until the end of our school year? Then what are our plans for the summer? What are our plans for the fall? Or rather than having it be time specific, you may think in terms of conditions. Um, Here's where we are right now under this set of conditions, and when that changes, when we have when we're able to open the school buildings with social distancing, here's our next set of plans. When we're able to bring small groups in here of students, and I'm not just talking about students with disabilities. I don't want there to be a misunderstanding that when Molly talked about individualized services, she was not suggesting that we need to look at providing one-on-one for all kids with disabilities. She was referring to, again, what we do through IDEA, making individualized decisions based on students' needs once we know how this is impacting kids as a whole. Um, so what would it look like if we could bring in small groups of kids, that mixture of kids with disabilities, without disabilities? What would it look like when we can bring in small groups of kids, maybe with more significant needs? So just looking, as Peter said, at the different scenarios, at the different needs as we go through this. This next slide, we really would like to work on some infographics to share. We've talked a good bit with stakeholders, particularly our parent advocacy groups, to work together on putting out consistent at a glance information. And this is one of our first infographics. We've talked from the beginning of our calls about the three priorities: health and safety first, and that includes mental health as well as physical health, that student needs come before compliance, that we are all doing our best to provide reasonable and practical access for our students with disabilities to these continued learning opportunities in light of these current circumstances. And as Peter said, and we'll go back to this again and again, this is where we are right now. At the beginning of this, things changed very rapidly, day to day, sometimes morning to evening. Things have, I hate to say, without knocking on wood, things seem to have settled down a little bit right now, in that we now know what we're facing, or at least what our circumstances will be until the end of the school year this year. So these are our circumstances right now. Those needs will change, student needs will change as family needs change, as our educational needs change. And then the importance of communication with all of our stakeholders. So our infographic that our IT folks in my office have done a great job with is to represent those three key areas: that we've got to take care of ourselves, that access is key to learning, and that communication within and among our stakeholders, our families, students, teachers, faculty, staff, everyone, will support the needs of students with disabilities. So we are going to be sending out more communication like this. You're welcome to use this in your communication with families. We're going to be asking our advocacy groups to share this kind of information as well. And if you have suggestions about other types of information or other ways to get this message across so that we can reassure folks, please let us know. As sort of a lead in to the meat of our discussion today, CEC, the Council for Administrators of Special Education, so CEC's CASE, has been doing a series of webinars on Friday afternoons at 1 o'clock. I think that they are open to anyone, even if you are not a member of CASE, and I think you can go back and access the webinars and the PowerPoints, again, even if you're not a member of CASE. These I have found to be extremely helpful. In one of the recent webinars, there were over 2,500 participants, and during the webinar, they surveyed those 2,500 participants. Now, these are state and local special ed administrators of some sort from across the nation. And what they found was that 76% of the folks who responded, those participants, responded that they had overdue evaluations due to COVID-19 closures. They had 60% of the responders say that they had parents who were requesting delays in timelines because of COVID-19 related issues. 79% of the respondents in the survey said that they would not be able to meet the requirements of their state performance plan annual performance report, things like their COSIF reporting because of COVID-19. 41% of the respondents said that they had to excuse more than the typical number of IEP team members because of COVID-19 related issues. And 43% of the respondents had parents that had requested the special ed services stop during the school closure. So I think from this you can see that this is a broad impact. This is impacting parents, students, staff, across all levels, school levels, district, state, and nationally. This is why the National Association of State Special Ed Directors and CASE wrote the joint letter to Congress requesting temporary and targeted flexibility. The request was not made to waive IDEA requirements or to do away with them. The request was made to grant some temporary and targeted, not across the board and not forever, but temporary and targeted flexibility during this unprecedented time. The National Association of School Psychologists and the elementary and secondary school principals groups also wrote very similar letters. And I think that it's important for us to make sure that this is where clear communication comes in again, that that we're not asking to waive IDEA requirements across the board. We're not saying that for the next 2 years we want initial timelines to be gone for evaluations. We're saying that during this unprecedented time, we are requesting temporary, time limited, and we've requested a specific time for this targeted flexibility for some of the specific requirements under IDEA that have been impacted by the school closures. At this point, Sandy, I'll stop to see if there's anything that I need to address from questions in the chat.
No, ma'am, not yet. This is Nicole. No, ma'am, not
Okay.
yet.
All right, Nicole, you might as well stay on. Nicole's going to walk us through sort of a discussion about, that's where that slide went. Sorry. Nicole's going to walk us through a discussion about the differences between extended school year, compensatory services, and school closure services. And go ahead.
This came from, we started this last week, late last week. That has been the consistent feedback, the consistent questions that we're getting on the link for questions. And people want definitions. They want clear steps forward. I will tell you, we presented this with our COVID stakeholder group, and this should have giant draft written across it. As a matter of fact, when it's sent out, it will have giant draft written across it, because we genuinely want your feedback. We are defining this. You guys are part of a stakeholder group that's going to help us define it. Now, having said that, I will say we did find the last time we walked through this first part, you have lots of questions that get answered towards the end. So I will be monitoring the chat. So if you guys want to, my suggestion to make this work well virtually is if you come to a question, or if there's something that you go, oh my God, what about da 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 da? I want you to type it in your chat, but don't hit enter yet. Because I don't want you to forget the question, but don't hit enter, because we found that we answered a lot of questions as we got a little further down. And we're definitely going to open this up for questions. I do want to respect everybody's time, and I will stay in the 30 minutes. So if I talk fast, I apologize. The other piece that came out of our COVID stakeholder group discussion is we're going to do a version of this with our parent stakeholder groups for parents, because we want to be sure that the communication is consistent between what you guys are hearing and what parents are hearing from us and from advocacy groups. So we'll do, for parents, of course, it will maybe not be quite so technical or quite so detailed, but we want to be sure that everyone is getting the same pieces of information. And then as we go through this, do know as well, total disclaimer, this is for what we know today. As you guys have seen, that can change tomorrow, that can change by the end of the week, that could change by the end of the school year, we don't know when social distancing will end. So this is definitely what is information that is good for today. And we will keep you up to date when there are more changes. And it might change by the end of the webinar based on additional guidance. And there's parts of this, particularly the pictures that came out of this, came off of the CASE webinar on this very topic. So please, the link there is good. Go check it out. The first 19 minutes, I believe, are not specifically this topic. So if you wanted to fast forward, because it's an hour and 1 minute long, if you wanted to fast forward through the first 19 minutes, or absolutely listen, it's good information. It's just not answering these questions. Next slide, please. So we wanted to provide a very specific definition of compensatory services. This is off OSEP's website. We didn't create this particular definition. And like I said, these examples in here are not comprehensive, so they will not answer every example that exists. Compensatory services are educational services that are awarded to students with disabilities to make up for services that they lost because of an LEA's failure to provide FAPE. So our post-school closure services, compensatory services. Next slide. So when teams are having a discussion about compensatory services, they need to talk about, thank you, Aisha. I'm a little choppy. I will get a little closer. The compensatory services, some of the discussions they need to have. So instruction looked different post-school closure. What did the student have access to the same instruction that non-disabled peers received during the school closure? If yes, and the student was able to access instruction delivered during the closure, that doesn't mean virtually, that means how your district was delivering that instruction. then you're not discussing compensatory services. You're discussing those supplemental services that we'll get to later. But if it's no, the format of the instruction was simply not accessible. And I will use a very black and white example I had mentioned during our meeting last week. For example, if you sent out packets to a student with a visual impairment and that was not either enlarged for their IEP or brailled for their IEP, they don't have access. Then you're discussing compensatory services because that student wasn't able to access their services. And then the other question that they would want to ask is, did the student receive a version of the services in their IEP? So example, they have 60 minutes of speech every single week in a small group setting. We have districts who have made the decision to not do speech services or related services. So that student isn't getting any version of that service. They're not being offered any version of that service. And the school does not stand ready and able to do some version of the service. So no, speech wasn't available. You need to discuss compensatory services. Now remember, compensatory services are not minute for minute what was missed. It's what it takes to make up for what that student did not progress during that time. So, but if you are offering a version of speech, you need to talk about supplemental services, not compensatory services. Next slide, please. So part 2, what if the service just wasn't something that even made sense in this post-school setting, post-school closure setting? And a super easy example is transportation. They're not allowed to go anywhere, so no transportation is necessary. There's no discussion of compensatory services. Now, we did provide a little more black and white example here. So the student has 1 hour per day of behavioral support related to transition from class to class or activity to activity. Now that's pretty gray. That's going to look different for every kid. But if that specific service was not necessary, it's not that they need a compensatory service, but they may have substantial issues returning to a regular schedule and have even greater transition from class to class issues when they return to an actual physical school building. It's not compensatory services, but you need to discuss supplemental services, and those supplemental services we'll discuss in a minute. Next slide. The extended school year services. Again, this definition comes from the feds. This isn't anything we determined specifically, but ESY is about, there's very specific questions and they're laid out in your IEP that you need to answer to say, is a student eligible for ESY? So our post-school closure services, extended school year services. Next slide, please.
And along those lines, remember that the purpose of extended school year services is to provide FAPE, because one of the first things you're asking is, if we stop specialized instruction at the end of the school year or at the end of whatever, at the beginning of fall break, at the beginning of winter break, and we don't continue, will that student be denied FAPE?
And we will also talk about how to determine that regression. The case webinar does an excellent job with it as well. So, has the student shown substantial regression for recruitment issues during the previous IEP or during previous breaks? Not exactly reflected in this slide is the way they discuss it in the case webinar, which is you need to consider your progress monitoring. Luckily, for most people, for most districts, there was almost exactly a progress report that went out right before closure. For most, I know that's not for all. So that was right at the end of a 9-week period. And so most everybody had progress reports that went out. It's that last one that you need to look at. That's your post-school. This period becomes a different time period. But as the as the team is answering this question, think about, have they had extended school year in the past? And is there data to show that they regress during the summer or possibly during winter breaks or other breaks? Discuss ESY. If they have had it before, they regress. You need to have a discussion about ESY, possibly supplemental services. And then if no, the student has never had extended school year, we don't have any data that would support a decision to say they need ESY, then they're likely not eligible. Or if you can look at that IEP and they're not working on some emerging skills or breakthrough skills, that student is probably not eligible for ESY. Now, I do want to be very careful and separate here. ESY, extended school year, is different from a summer school program like the Jump Start that Peter mentioned. Jump Start is not a service per se. It's the district erring on the side of all students to say, we want to get a head start on this next school year because this last semester, this last part of the school was so crazy, we're going to offer it to everybody. That is not ESY. That is an instructional opportunity. ESY would be if this student doesn't get this, they're not getting FAPE. Next slide. Now, this is one of the things that are right out of the CASE webinar, and they do a very good job of this. So at the point that schools closed, analyze the data and determine the progress at the point schools closed, and consider ESY based on prior regression data. And if they've already been identified, and then you make your decisions based on that. And then we will come back to this exact same infographic. This is for ESY. And we'll have another part that says, here's what you need to do now, and then here's what you need to do coming up. So next slide, please.
So what we're saying with ESY is you're going to make your decisions on ESY from where the student started June of 2019 or August, the first day of school, to the day you closed. You're going to consider that that was your school year. Those are the data that you're going to look at, that data set, to make your extended school year decisions. Because again, you're looking at how the student was progressing towards his annual goals until the time that we close schools.
Now, this is the part that we are defining, and we definitely need, you guys are a part of this definition and part of creating this definition. This is the all us portion of this. So supplemental school closure services is what we've kind of been calling the services that students need because of this closure or because of the way instruction was delivered during this time, or any of the, oh my gosh, this craziness. So, and it's related to extending learning and the challenge to the change to the instructional environment. And teams need to determine where the student was and where the student is now, and then the services they need moving forward. I believe our next slide has our very specific questions that we would like teams to think about. Oh, no, okay. That we moved this around from our last presentation. No, go ahead, go back to it because it makes sense there. So this again is from that CASE webinar, and we're saying this is why it is critical to maintain documentation of what services were offered, because this is what also when a team is going to go back and say, do we need compensatory services? Services were absolutely offered. So let's talk about whether that's compensatory or supplemental. And then you need to take documentation of what services were delivered and collect when you can. We totally get you can't always get progress, monitor progress during this time. When you can, collect the progress that you can when the services are delivered and under those frameworks. So essentially, do now is document as much as you can. And then next slide. That way, when the teams get back together, they're gonna, the next slide, not this one, don't change it yet, has very specific questions on the questions the team should ask and answer. So Considerations for current services, whether or not the flexibility is provided with respect to procedural compliance during COVID-19, continue to offer services as best as you can. I believe the phrase that Becky has been using is the district needs to communicate that we stand ready and available to provide services. And you need to communicate that to parents, even the ones who say, thanks, but no thanks, we don't want services. It may be just whatever form of communication you know you can reliably get to that parents and say, we're here at this time, at this play, this bat time, this bat channel. We're here for you when you need us. That will also lessen complaints and hopefully lawsuits. It's just very important. A good PR piece is, and I'm going to give a shout out to Lexington One at this point. I am a parent who has a student with a disability at Lexington High School. I could not, they have had very consistent communication with me. They have continually offered services and even gone above and beyond what would be typical to say, because I also happen to have a child who got very sick and got pneumonia and had a terrible experience for a couple of weeks. And they were utterly amazing. And that good PR goes a long, long way. As a parent, I can tell you that's amazing. So shout out Lexington High School. And then make good faith recommendations. Try to do, it does here say offer ESY services. And I would say even not even necessarily offer ESY. We've talked a lot about, as a leadership team here at OSIS, with the CARES funds and the things that we could do for that summer, that instructional jumpstart that Peter was talking about to begin with. Because we went around to, oh my gosh, as an ED self-contained teacher, if I could have my kids for 2 extra weeks, because this closure has an absolute possibility to wreck a couple of years of great instruction and work, hard work, and different behavior intervention plans for those kids that they might have been doing great, but might fall apart when this all comes back together because they may have been stuck with the very folks that kind of created their ED-ness to begin with. So that instructional jumpstart, if it's possible, that goes back to Becky's recommendations last week of start surveying your teachers, see who's available. And I think it's just those good faith efforts that are in the best interest of the kids are going to go a long way. Trying to find those supplemental school closure services right now. You can get back face to face with them. That's not now. That's the next part. So go ahead to the next slide, Becky. So supplemental school closure services are not, we will definitely include that webinar link again. Supplemental school closure services are not compensatory services, although a student could need both. They're not ESY, even though a student could need both. And it's definitely not, absolutely not a minute for minute replacement or additional minutes that the student did not receive during the closure. And it's not in addition to the regular school day. It is not fair or equal in any way to say special education kids, because of COVID-19, you don't have a 7.5-hour school day. You now have a 9-hour school day. That's not supplemental school closure services. Next slide, please. So these are the questions that the team is going to need to ask to figure out if a school needs supplemental school closure services. So what instruction was delivered to all students? And I can tell you that's different in every district. That's different sometimes by schools or definitely by grade levels in every single district. So what instruction was delivered and how did the school figure out the learning of all students during the closure? This part is where the documentation is absolutely necessary. What was given during the closure, and then what did the student progress report say before the school closure? And once they returned to school, what was the progress towards goals? And what was the trend in progress monitoring showing before and after school closure, and how do those trend lines compare? So other than those first two questions, you'll notice this is very similar to how you get to determining compensatory services, but they're not the same. They are different because you need to talk about everybody went through this. We did not deny a FAPE. We offered, however, here's where everybody falls out, and here's what you need in order to make things up. For some kids, that might mean an additional section of resource. That might mean push-in services plus resource. For some kids, that might mean that you are working on similar goals that you have historically. It all depends on that progress monitoring, where they were at and where they are now. Next slide, please. And so this is then the supplemental determinations. This is that last part. This is how you're talking about analyzing the COVID impact, plan for the fall curriculum, mapping and remapping, and implementing summer services based on regression analysis. So Becky shared some of the, no, she talked about the case stuff where they were talked about some compliance issues. NWEA has also done some studies. Obviously, they are probably getting their information from MAP on what to expect. And they are saying things like, on top of your regular summer slide, kids are going to retain about 70% in reading and about 50% in math. So check out that website, not the website, the webinar, because it'll also give you some, oh my gosh, we need to plan for XYZ. Next slide, please. And so 3 key points in data. So when was the end of in-person services? The end of the school year. So the time period when you're doing, that's the same case webinar. That was at the one I just referenced is the same case webinar. Like I said, it's about an hour and a minute long, so it covers a lot. So the 3 key points of data are the end of in-person services, end of the school year, and the beginning of the school year. Now this next piece, if you go to the next slide, this slide should, if I'm on the right pace here, we changed some things up. There we go, it is right. So the other piece we have heard from people, and we get 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Some people want very explicit guidance, and some people say, we're really not, we're really okay, kind of leave us alone. So we've gone back and forth, and this is definitely one of the places we want a substantial feedback. So guidance for general education minutes. This is from the, was put out by the department for general ed, and you'll see with the summer services in the 3rd column. Just a minute, let me show you this next slide. What this is, this next slide is what that would translate to special education right now. So go ahead and change to the next slide, Becky. So if we were to extrapolate from a 7.5-hour day per 1 hour, per 1 hour of services, that becomes substantially less than what you guys may be thinking. Because I think part of the pitfall, as Becky gets back to the slide, part of the pitfall is we're thinking in minute per minute or hour per hour type replacements or discussions. And that's not the type of discussion we need to be having. So if we were to think, as Molly talked about in her webinar today, okay, as I say, Becky, I don't know if you know that you're not on the PowerPoint anymore.
I do, and I'm working on it, I promise.
One of the things Molly talked about in her press conference today was one of the things we discovered is we were asking kids to do way too much. And that is where those general ed minutes came out. So those recommendations were to be, if we were to look at what we're suggesting for general ed, this is how it would look for special ed. So if you've got a self-contained kid, you need to be looking at those 2 middle columns, because if they're in special ed all day, that's the number of minutes that are being suggested for general ed. They're in special ed all day, this is what their minutes would look like. That last column, this would be and we did it just per hour of services because that's a typical block or an typical period. So for your middle schoolers, you're looking at an hour per week, 2 hours max. Woo. Sorry, that is to tell me my daughter needs to get ready for her own class. So is this the type of guidance you guys would like to see? Would you like to see something like that? I'm going to look at the chat pod for just a second while you guys let that digest.
And again, this is suggested. I will put on the PowerPoint before we post it. At the beginning, we do have the link to the case webinar. I will also put the link to the NWEA presentation that was done. This is, again, just the kind of, this is kind of the way you need to be thinking. Again, if you've got a first or second grader that's getting about an hour of instruction, then you're talking about 35 minutes to an hour a week of specially designed access, because again, that's if that child needs it. We're at this point talking about access to whatever you're offering through Gen Ed.
Well, and I was going to say, looking through the chat pod, I will tell you, you're absolutely right. We don't know if we're going to be able to get into buildings in the middle of the summer. We have no clue. And that falls in line with what Peter was discussing earlier. Have a plan A, a plan B, and possibly a plan C. Now, Becky, there is a question here about making ESY determinations. Should they be waiting until they know if the building will be open during the summer, or try to make those determinations now? And would it be plan A, here's how we deliver ESY, plan B, here's how we deliver ESY?
I think you can, for those of you who need to go ahead and make ESY decisions, I think you can make them now. But you're going to need to make them with a, here's what it will look like if we can get back into buildings. Here's what it will look like if we can't. And depending on how things change, parents, we may have to get back together when we know a little bit more. But I do think that you've got to help communicate. You've got to understand, and then second, you've got to help parents understand that when you're making an ESY decision, it's based on where that kid was and all the data you had collected up to the day we closed. Your ESY decisions aren't made at this point based on what's going on during the closure, because that's not typical school. So you're going to need to really rely, like Nicole said, go back and look. If this kid's been with you for a while, did he need ESY last year? Did he need it in the past? What was his performance like when he came back from winter break? Because remember, ESY is just not the summer break. It's also any break in services.
Absolutely. And some of the feedback in the chat right now is everyone's a little worried about misinterpretations for parents. And you're absolutely right. Which is why we would create something very specific for parents that would communicate the same intent, but look very different. Next slide, Becky.
There are no more slides, Nicole.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So I thought there was a little bit more. Hey, are there questions at ends type slide? So now is the time. Where's your guys' questions?
And while you're looking at questions, I need to make an announcement that I hate to make. Peter will be leaving us at the end of April. And Peter, I'll let you share with the group what you want to, or share with the group a few minutes. We will miss him tremendously.
We'll make sure.
He has, and I told him the other day that I don't know anybody else that did not have an instructional or educational background that would have come into the job that he did and put as much effort into learning the instructional and programmatic aspect of this than he has. He has been a tremendous asset to the office, to the state, and I know has helped you in the districts tremendously. So, Peter, I'm going to put you on the spot if you want to say anything to the group.
Sure. No, it's been an amazing time at the State Department. I've learned so much from my colleagues there at the department, and from all the directors and teachers and parents that I spoke with over the years. You know, it's been great. I made a decision, and this was obviously a pre-pandemic decision to kind of go back to my law career in the private setting. So I'm going to go back, to practicing law and representing universities and public agencies and school districts, and so that's the goal. And it took a lot of thought and time. I like I said, I've made a lot of great friends. So I'm sure I'll see you around somewhere. I'm not leaving the state or anything, but it's been really great being at the department. And like I said, I felt like I got a unique opportunity to that most attorneys don't get, which is to go ahead and really learn how schools operate, to take the time to hear from parents and students and teachers and administrators. And a lot of times you don't get that opportunity. You just observe things based on case law or things you read, but when you see it firsthand, it's entirely different. So that's been amazing, and I can't thank you all enough for how much you've taught me over the years. It's been amazing. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I told everybody, every day I came to work because of the people I was working with and the people I got to see. And there's so many great people in special ed in the state of South Carolina that it's been amazing. So thank you very much. And like I said, you'll run into me again, I'm sure, somewhere, sometime. And I hope the best for all of you during this tough time.
And Peter, the chat will be saved. There are lots of wonderful messages to you in the chat box, so that we'll save the chat and so that you'll have that to take with you. Are there any questions? Yes.
I was gonna say, I'm not seeing specific questions or necessarily specific questions. Just let's be careful how and where we publish this type information. Yep. Which duly noted, absolutely. If you guys happen to have any specific feedback, in particular on the definition piece or things that you'd like to see included, please feel free to email me. I would love. This is not ready to go live, but we did want to get you guys some definitions and how this is going.
Yep. All right, I'm going to end things 2 whole minutes early. Again, I appreciate your time. Any feedback you have, any questions, if it's the generic COVID-19 question, please continue submitting through the website. I will tell you that the website question link, I think, sorry, I got distracted. Imagine that. Again, if you've got general COVID-19 questions, go ahead and submit those still through the online system. If specific feedback for this, any of us in our office, please email with questions, concerns, additional considerations, and suggestions. I hope everybody has a great rest of the week, and we will talk soon. Thanks all.